Peace is not the absence of anything, nor is it something which is absent in times of turmoil. It's not what occurs when activity ceases. Rather, it is that space in which all activity occurs. That peace is always there, always available, neither arising nor subsiding. It's just that it becomes obscured by our thoughts and emotions. When our attention is absorbed in these things, it's very difficult to perceive that peace which underlies all experience. And this peace is also not a feeling or an emotion, but rather it is emotionally neutral. It is that space in which feelings and emotions arise and subside, both pleasant and unpleasant. There have been times in my life when I have felt intense grief or anxiety or sorrow, and yet accompanying those emotions was a deep sense of peace. And it's a very difficult thing to convey to anyone who has not had that experience. It may seem like a contradiction. How can one experience some intensely unsettling emotion and also experience peace at the same time? How can these two things coexist simultaneously? The analogy that best describes this is that of the sky. The sky itself is a vast open space. But within that space, all kinds of weather occurs. There can be storms and hurricanes, rain and hail and howling winds. But the sky is unaffected by the weather. The sky remains constant and unchanged. Only the weather changes. Clouds come and go. And even when there is a storm that lasts for days, even when the clouds are spread across a large area, it never fills the sky entirely. There is always more empty space than there are clouds. And while it may appear dark for those who see the storm from below, above the clouds, the sky is open and the sun is shining brightly. Our emotions are like clouds passing through the sky, sometimes subtle, sometimes intense, sometimes brief, and sometimes lingering. And generally, our awareness will be contracted to a small point within that emotional experience. And from that perspective, from the inside of that emotion looking outward, the whole world may appear dark and dismal and cloudy. But if we can expand our awareness beyond the emotion, which doesn't mean turning our attention away from it, it simply means that the field of awareness expands beyond the boundaries of the emotion, so that the emotion remains within that field and is surrounded by spaciousness. And that spaciousness is like the sky which contains the weather. In that, there is the recognition of a stillness, a recognition of silence, of spaciousness through which the emotion is passing. And so, in that moment, there is the experience of the emotion, whatever it happens to be, but there is also the space which surrounds it as well as permeates it. And you are that space. You're not the emotion. You're the space in which the emotion is occurring. And if you observe this enough, you'll come to see that emotions come and go within that space, but the space is always open and unaffected. So this is what we call inner peace. It is that spacious awareness which is unaffected by thoughts and emotions, unaffected by sense perceptions, including both pleasure and pain, unaffected by events and circumstances, unaffected by anything. There is nothing which can affect it. Everything is transitory, yet that peace remains constant. And the way to experience this peace is not through the avoidance or resistance or denial of unpleasant emotions, or avoiding or escaping challenging situations. It is available to us at all times, regardless of the circumstances. But it's certainly much easier to recognize in moments when there are no disturbances. And so we might put aside some time to just give our attention to this. And we can do this early in the morning, or late at night, or at any time when we don't have other things that need attending to. We can do this whenever there are moments of outer calmness, when there's not a lot of activity taking place, when the outer world is relatively still and silent. We can just give our attention to the moment, noticing the stillness, noticing the silence, and just allowing our awareness to rest in that space, and to notice how there is a stillness which permeates the entire field of our awareness, not just in the world outside of us, but inside as well. It may also be helpful to limit our distractions and disturbances, to limit those things which stimulate emotional reactivity and agitate the mind. And I'm only talking in terms of those things which are entirely voluntary, which are entirely optional, like spending a lot of time on social media, or watching the news, or engaging in aggravating conversations, like gossiping or arguing. There's so many things we give our attention to unnecessarily. There's so much information we consume that has no benefit. And there's so many issues we involve our attention in, which don't really involve us. We get agitated hearing about and discussing matters which have nothing to do with us, which don't personally involve us, and which we don't become personally involved in, other than talking about it, thinking about it, emotionally reacting to it. And so it doesn't result in anything other than agitation. And this doesn't include those things which do personally involve you, like your job or your relationships. I'm not suggesting that you avoid those things. I'm not suggesting that you quit your job and leave your relationship and go live alone in a cave. I'm only talking about the additional sources of agitation that we unnecessarily give attention to. Because even the difficulties which are immediate and unavoidable can be much more easily dealt with if our attention isn't scattered, if we're not distracted by things occurring outside of those situations. We can focus more attention on resolving problems in our personal lives if we're not busying our minds with problems that don't involve us. So if we can reduce distractions, reduce disturbances, and to take time to just rest in stillness, if we take to this practice, if we do this consistently, it becomes much easier to acknowledge that stillness even during moments of activity, when there may be a lot of commotion, when there's a lot of sounds occurring, and even when we're faced with challenges or when we're experiencing something unpleasant. Because what we're essentially doing is cultivating a sensitivity to that stillness, so that regardless of the situation, we can more easily come into a space of clarity and calmness. And of course, it's not always so easy to be in that space. It's our habitual tendency to be absorbed in thoughts, consumed by emotions, to be impulsively reactive, or to be fixated on pain, or fixated on problems. It's habitual for our awareness to become contracted within these kinds of experiences, so much so that we fail to perceive the space in which these things are occurring. So it takes a bit of practice to open up to this spaciousness, to recognize this underlying peace. And even if you cultivate a sensitivity to this, contractions may still occur from time to time. It's just the way that our minds operate. I don't always feel at peace every moment of every day. There are times when my attention is absorbed in some thought or emotion. But as soon as I notice, just in the noticing, there is a stepping back. It's like stepping out of that thought or emotion and into the wider space of observation, going from contracted awareness to expanded awareness. And just in that, the intensity of the emotion is decreased or diluted by the vastness of the space in which it's encompassed. What can also be very helpful is mindful breathing. Whenever we feel some intense emotion, you might notice how it feels in the chest. Generally, the chest feels tight. There's a contraction in the chest, a tightness in the breath, as if your breath is being restricted. And so if we take a few slow, deep breaths, it helps to release that tension, allowing everything to open up and expand. And this also encourages an expansion of awareness. But as we practice coming into this state of expanded awareness and resting in that space, it becomes much more natural as well as much easier to access even during moments of intense emotion or physical pain. Or we might notice that we're generally more calm and composed, and that even those things which used to elicit an intense emotional reaction, we may find ourselves much less reactive, or in some cases, no reaction at all. But even if there is, we can simply notice and take a step back into the greater space of awareness, and to just notice that even in the presence of that emotion, there is an underlying peace. So this peace is always there, always present, always available. It's just that we aren't always aware of it. It isn't something that comes and goes. It's only our attention which comes and goes. Or rather, our attention tends to get pulled into thoughts and emotions, becoming absorbed or contracted. And so we only need to expand our awareness in order to perceive it. So this is something we can practice. To put aside a moment of time each day, to simply sit still and to notice this spaciousness. And if your life is particularly busy or stressful or hectic, all the more reason to take time to rest. As I like to say, why do we wait until we're dead to rest in peace? Why not rest in peace now, while you still live?